You're listening to Music Tectonics.
Hey everyone, this is Tristra New Year Yeager, your irregular host here at Music Tectonics, the podcast where we dig around beneath the surface of music and tech. When not chatting here, I'm strategist at Rock Paper Scissors, the music tech PR firm behind this podcast. Today, we are going to have a fun conversation. Thanks to our amazing guest, Dario Slavazza, who has been head of curation at Feed for the past 3 years and counting. Dario is an ethnomusicologist by training, with extensive music and arts background, as well as a very sharp ear for finding the perfect music for fitness, retail, and healthcare apps and settings. We'll talk more about exactly what that involves in a second, but first, Dario, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I always love to hear, everyone in the music business is in this because they have usually a passion for music. So I want to hear how yours began. What got you into music?
It's sort of nebulous in the sense that I grew up in a household where music and dance were just, important beyond, playing or, sort of listening. It just sort of became the DNA of how we communicated with each other. And, it's something that from a very early age for me was a strong passion. I come from a family of people, of scientists and designers, but they're all very creative people, and music for me is where I found that and sort of encouraged early on. And so it's something that has always been. I've been playing the saxophone since I was about 7 or 8, and making music just in noise and generally since then.
That's wonderful. How did you decide to study music academically, and specifically ethnomusicology, which, for those of you out there who may not know this, is the study of music from non-Western classical cultures and communities? How did you get interested in that particular line of study?
It happened by chance. I was going to university and had plans to be a saxophone performance major, but our professor had gone sabbatical, and left with that option of just sort of floating, found myself gravitating towards the professors and the curriculum in ethnomusicology. And I think for me, the thing that really stuck out about it was this sort of idea of immersing yourself, not just in music, but the culture of music. I come from a mixed background, and my parents have very different tastes in music. And I always found that interesting and fascinating, how those things sort of grow, develop, what is important to somebody. And again, not just in a musicological perspective as far as theory and these other things, but the sort of extra musical layer that's on top of it.
And that layer really comes in handy in your work now, as I understand. First, but let's talk a little bit about exactly what that role means. Curation is one of those terms that's kind of curious terms that blur a lot of distinct roles and tasks. So how do you define the role of a curator?
It's something that I think is deceptively simple in that, when people think about, playlists or radio stations, you think, oh, yes, I get to pick the music that I like and want to listen to, be it something that I am deeply familiar with or something that's, new and hot and that I'm really into. But when you're curating, you're almost taking on the role of someone who works at an ad agency in that sense, and that you're not just speaking from your voice, and more often than not you're actually eliminating your voice and speaking from and to a totally different set of people. And the challenge and the complexity is to understand what a group is interested in, what kind of music they like, how that speaks to them, and then from most of our work, how that works in the context of fitness and working out, which is a whole different spectrum from just normal listening habits as well.
How do you approach trying to solve that problem? That's a complex set of interlocking perspectives. It almost sounds like an ethnographic question,
It is, and I think that's for me why I'm so well suited to doing this kind of work, and I think from our company's perspective why the human element is so important, because there is a good portion of it that we can sort of do analysis and allow numbers to tell us, right? BPM, song length. There are ways of measuring danceability or intensity of a song, but really understanding how those songs work in the context of different workouts for different instructors for different kinds of things takes a human element of understanding the broader cultural implications. And that's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, engaging with, and, working out to meld with just the actual numbers, getting the right BPM for spin classes and, all of these other things that sort of inform the songs that we're choosing.
So you're working very closely with your clients, I imagine, in kind of a dialogue as you're going through this discovery process. And, it can be really tough for non-musicians to find the words they're looking for to describe what they want to hear. Sometimes the people have a really good sense and they just don't know exactly how to articulate it. So how do you help them with that problem? I mean, how do you help them express their needs? So if I'm, how would I go about it if I were building if I wanted to curate some fitness classes, or I was building a fitness app or something along those lines, how would I how could I learn to find the right vocabulary so we could have a good conversation, like sort of the musical equivalent of a mood board, something like that. How do you manage that with clients? How do you help them get better at talking about what they need?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest issue, with music, in that, music professionals are oftentimes speaking a totally different language than, the average listener or even people who are music enthusiasts, and music in general is something that is very subjective. And so there's a lot of, sort of ambiguities as opposed to what something wants, and I think for us, the first thing is really getting down to those hard numbers, using those as much as possible to give us guide rails, right? And that's tempo, other things like the years that things were released, that really just like what is, when someone says throwback, that's something that is, based on who's saying it and who there's the group that's going to be listening to it means very different things. And so trying to use those hard numbers. And then beyond that, I mean, the beauty of it is we have all this art to use. And so, creating, like you said, not a sound collage, but yeah, the sound mood board examples. I think that is the thing that speaks, volumes beyond trying to just describe the music, saying it's hip or it's fast. Like, just give me a song. Like, what do you mean? Show me. And I think that more than anything, we spend a lot of time working with our clients about demographics and the kind of songs and the moods. But, for me, at the end of the day, give me 10 to 20 songs that you think really fit with what you're trying to do. And that's just so much more valuable.
That makes tons of sense. So, you've had quite a bit of experience in curating music for different clients. I'm wondering if you have a few really interesting examples or anecdotes you'd want to share. Like, for instance, your favorite unexpected combination of music or artists that worked for a project, even though no one really expected they would, sort of like the chocolate and peanut butter, or like, the salt and caramel of the music curation experience. Tell me a bit about some of your favorite moments.
I think musically is something that I've really enjoyed is, you know, finding the spaces where people are finding confidence through music, and, in ways of expressing things that aren't always on the surface. I think right now is a great time, and the amount of companies that are making, playlists for Pride Month is just great to see. And also the breadth of what that means, right? Because a Pride station, it could mean so many different things. And I think that's something that, to do that kind of work and sort of see that it's not just, what you would consider stereotypical for, like a queer community music, is it means very different things. Sometimes it's, the orientation of the artist, but sometimes it's, the context of the music. And I think for me, that's really enjoyable. From an extra musical perspective, I think for me in particular, getting to experience and experiment with our customers. We were working on a spin class with one of our customers, and so it meant I got to do a lot of spin. And it meant I actually did a lot of testing with an instructor. So I got my own one-on-one spin class. And so I got to make the stations for my own spin class, and then actually, have a bike and then another bike facing me with an instructor. And we got to, sort of run through these and get a hands-on experience of what it's like to feel the transitions and what songs, work and don't work. And some surprise you. Sometimes a song that you're like, oh, this is, when you're sitting at your desk and you're listening to it, you're like, oh, this is great. It's upbeat. It's got all this. I really love the song Julian by Carly Rae Jepsen. I think it's a great song. The bridge is really interesting. It does some key changes that I really like. But man, it just doesn't work in spin. And it was something to find that out while you're on the bike, standing off the seat is just it's a really great experience. And so I think things like that, which also in simpler, just sometimes making a playlist and going for a run, is more telling than anything else.
You actually caught me. That's one of my favorite things to do. And to try to come up with really odd things to run to, like, Norwegian folk pop or something. Like,
Yeah.
there's so many cool things that can inspire positive sort of movement connections without being the sort of typical stuff that we all expect. So that is so cool. What are some of the things you'd love to see change about anything in any aspect of your job, be it how metadata works or how people approach playlists, or what are how people rely on algorithms? What are some things that you wish would change in the future?
I think, you said metadata first. That's something that, if you're not in the industry, people don't really think about, but it's something I could give a whole talk about, the value of proper metadata, the lack of infrastructure around it right now. I think, for me as a curator, and for us as a company, that is something that is so critical and is so often overlooked for various reasons. It's something that is, built on a system that isn't always supported. Metadata, can range anywhere from just a spreadsheet that somebody's keeping, to I've seen people still have actual physical, files. Sometimes it just doesn't exist. And it's something that unfortunately doesn't allow us to really leverage a lot of material that we'd like to, because there's not enough information there. And then on the flip side of that, people who aren't properly being credited, in that, it was a big deal when, streaming companies started putting, producer credits and songwriter credits, but that's not easy because that information just isn't actually there sometimes. And so even if you want to put it in, it just doesn't exist. And there's whole companies built around trying to find this information, and it's still a challenge to consolidate it, and the fact that there isn't some sort of universal format is something that I find baffling. And I'm always just sort of thinking about, how do we change this? But, it starts at the very beginning. It's something that I always found so frustrating, that when you make a song, if you're recording in Pro Tools and you finish making a song, adding the metadata to that file is hard. It's just difficult from the very beginning of the process. And so it's something that unfortunately requires the entire industry and very different segments of that to all do the lifting and sort of make that process easier in that sense. Aside from that, I think just more education. Music licensing, just like the metadata that goes with it, is complicated. Sometimes someone would say convoluted, and a big part of that comes from people not being properly educated on what it means to properly license something, to make sure that all of the rights holders are being paid, that everything's being documented, because it is a sort of very fractured sort of landscape. And so I think for me, I would just love to see some standardization, and and a lot of those different aspects come together. I think it would really help everybody.
Yeah, that is definitely something that has been a long time dream, and hopefully there have been some very positive movements lately in the direction of maybe we could actually figure this out, just maybe. What kind of metadata is missing? Just for any sort of publishers, catalog folks out there, rights holders who might be listening. From your perspective, what metadata is the most valuable beyond the sort of basics that for in terms of fitness or healthcare programming when it comes to what you do?
Yeah, I think that's the idea, right? Is that if a publishing house has 100% of their rights, that's fine. It's easy, right? They're a one-stop shop. If they have, especially if they, it's somebody who has both sides, problem solved. There's no questions, right? But when you only own 20% or even 80%, it's not just about having your information, right? It's, more often than not, publishers, record labels don't know who has that other 20%. They know how much they have, and that's sort of where the information stops. And so if you're someone who's interested in that material, you now have to go out and find who that other 20% is. And and if that's split between 4 or 5 different rights holders, the fact that none of them really have information on who owns the other portion of that is a huge roadblock for anybody that wants to use that material. And so I think that just I think the awareness, I think it's one of the reasons why things, like blockchain are so appealing. You're like, oh, I get to see where all of this is and who owns all of this in a way that is up to date and usable. And that's something that doesn't exist now. A record label knows that we have the master recording, and our affiliate publishing house has 50%, but question mark on the rest of it. And so it's up to anyone who wants to have access to that to sort of now, play detective. And I think that's like I said, a huge hurdle.
One other big hurdle I imagine curators face is just finding good music, especially with the deluge of amazing music that's coming out all the time. And especially in new styles, new genres, now that we're basically a global music marketplace or world. What are some discovery tools you wish were there? What are some ways for finding and surfacing stuff for you to sort of listen to and evaluate? Like if you could make anything happen, what would those tools look like or sound like?
I think it really depends on the genre or sort of, space you're working in. I don't think there's, a one-stop shop in that sense. If you're listening to dance music, there are certain, sites and, other places where you can go. But if you listen to heavy metal, it's very different. I think as a curator, oftentimes, one of our challenges is actually trying to get past the algorithm. It constantly wants to serve up things that we already have and already like. And so it's how do you break past that and get to the space where I can sort of just like find new things. One of the things that I think in the last year has been challenging, I often did that by traveling, you know, being in a new place with different people and okay, what are they listening to here? What's popular here? And then for us as curators, almost trying to do the same thing on the internet. I think going off the beaten path is really where a lot of good discovery comes in that sense, going outside of the larger sort of gatekeepers in that sense. There's a lot of fun websites and resources that'll, list hits in different countries or, throughout different times and years. And I think that in conjunction with, taking a very academic approach to researching in the sense of, really delving into a sound, an artist, a genre, and then branching out from there and exploring all the connectivity, building a big map of connections, I think is the best way to explore and discover. It's one of my favorite things. There's several websites that do this for electronic music, in various formats, but where they list all the different genres and examples and splinter these huge webs, and I just love spending time on those because it just leads you down rabbit holes that you wouldn't normally follow. And like I said, off the beaten path, I think is the best way for discovery.
And how you've gone on this sort of quest and you've gone down these interesting back alleys and found these nooks and crannies of fascinating music, and then you take it back and how does the licensing work, right? I guess that's where the two sides need to come together.
Well, exactly. I think that's the challenge. I think in film, it's what makes such a good music supervisor. Is somebody that not only finds something interesting but can deliver on it. And I think we feed the different models that we use for licensing are one of the reasons why that's so functional. And that with our B2B products, We're using, licenses that allow us access to a huge, portion of recorded music. And with Adapter, we're pre-licensing a lot of these things so that if someone finds them in this context, they know that they already have access to it and can use them. Because otherwise, yeah, you're sort of a shot in the dark, especially when you talk about a global, sort of marketplace, but everyone's still operating on a country by country basis for licensing, you know? And so even if you have users that are around the world, if you find this great song, you may only be able to use it in the United States or maybe only in Britain, and it doesn't give you across all of those territories. And so it's challenging in that sense. And I think the other side of that too, is tempering discovery, especially in fitness, with familiarity. And it's one thing to think of just a hot playlist of all the greatest new songs, but how do you temper that with things that people are familiar with and want to listen with, and strike a balance.
I want to get back a little bit to your off the beaten path / global observations. In a recent blog post, think it was one of your colleagues wrote about how Curation has in general been able to embrace more and more of these songs that are either cross-cultural, multilingual, or that aren't in the language spoken where they will be used. So they maybe a Spanish language song for a predominantly English-speaking audience. Tell me a little bit about that process, because I think you've been in the business long enough to see that sea change as there's been more and more interest and acceptance of non-English pop. It wasn't always that way, right? So how has that felt from your perspective?
I think it's been great. I think it used to be the case, for any band that wasn't in the United States or an English speaking country, that if you wanted hits, you had to speak English, and you had to sing in English. They think of so many bands that made that. Phoenix is a great example of a band, that made the decision to speak in English, and the Hives, it used to be right, yeah, the sort of the threshold, but you lose a lot of the local color and flavor and what makes a lot of those places so interesting when you do that. And I think it's really great for artists to have the freedom to be able to express themselves in these different ways, and it's something that's been slowly changing. I hope it continues to change, but I think a big portion of that too is that, with the internet and people moving away from, being so hyper localized, that people are forming themselves into new groups that aren't just based on where they are. And that allows, an artist from Colombia to be really big in not just Latin America. And I think that that's, really great. And yeah, and I think a big portion of that has to do with American audiences opening up to not being the sort of center of the universe in that sense. And I think it's slowly happening in film as well, and in literature. And it's something that I think is bigger than music in that sense. It's not just a trend within music, it's more of a cultural shift, and we're seeing it reflected in music.
Speaking of shifts, I was curious about what has been going on from your perspective in the fitness world when it comes to music. Now, I don't want you to have to spill too much of the secret sauce or reveal any trade secrets, but the fitness industry in terms of digital apps and virtual experiences has gone through a major revolution the past year and a year and a half, roughly. So how has that affected your work? What kind of, are you putting together different kinds of music for people? Are at-home workouts radically different from in-studio workouts or in-person workouts? Are you noticing any differences, or is it more just a question of volume?
I mean, yeah, digital has exploded. It's something that there were a lot of people who were working in that space that saw their user bases and all of these things explode. There's another segment of the industry who were mostly brick and mortar and had digital sort of in the back burner, and once that wasn't an option, really had to push into that space and get into it. And so that has been a big shift. I think from our perspective, for curating for that, not a lot has changed, but there is a distinct difference between an in-person class with an instructor, with another group of people, and an online class. The energy is different. The way you engage with it is different. And also, more often than not, with a digital class, there's the likelihood that it's going to be taken again and again. And so it has to have a replay value that a live class is just never intended to have. And so I think from a fitness industry perspective, it takes a huge shift of, approach to really come at things with, this more open-minded, and that, it's not, I'm in New York, I have this yoga studio, and it's who comes to it, and that's it, and it's done, and it's over. That people all around the country or the world might be listening to this, engaging with it. They might also all be doing it at 8 a.m. They might do it after dinner. And so having that sort of approach really takes a wider lens. And so that's something that we spend a lot of time working with our customers doing.
So if it's intended for replay, does that mean just there needs to be more variety in the track selections? I mean, so say I have like a series of 5 classes. I don't want to have, like just for example, Beyonce dominating every single one of those classes. I mean, maybe I do. Maybe that's my brand. But, if you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't want to wear people down with like, don't stop believing every single class. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. This is a class or something that someone might do several times a week. They find their favorite instructor and they find this class they really like. And then the last thing you want is to have the same music playing over and over again, and if it is, by a major artist like Beyonce, that's also going to be very expensive to have the same music, playing over and over again synced with your video, and so you want something that is consistent from an experience, and that the person doing it is properly motivated and that everything works out, but you also do want it to have freshness and have a life beyond just a one-time listen. And so that's something that is not always easy to do. It takes a certain ear to be able to put together music for a class that will have that kind of life. And one of the things we do for a lot of our clients is they have radio stations that they use for their classes, and we update them constantly. Every month we go back and we take out songs that aren't working, add songs that are, and keep them fresh so that you have consistency, and that the majority of what's in there is the same, but that it's freshened up over time, and so that it has this life that is much longer than just a one-off.
Thanks for explaining that and going into sort of the nuts and bolts of how all this works. And thanks in general for coming to talk with us today. So, Dario, before we go, this could be not necessarily about your work in curation or even about fitness or any of that kind of thing. But I always love to ask people if they could imagine one really cool new invention related to music tech, what would it be? What would yours be? If you could wave a magic wand and create anything, what would that look like?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I think something that's a really interesting and intriguing space, and there's a lot of people working in this, is a lot of, sort of spatial sound.
Yeah.
But as it stands right now, right, there's the sort of the theatrical aspect of it, and Dolby Surround and all of these things. But as far as music is concerned, there are big installations. There's a few, particularly in San Francisco in the Bay Area. We have Audium and Envelope, which are these big 360 theaters and sort of, installations that, although great, are obviously unwieldy and not built for the average person. I think something that really exploring that sort of spatial aspect of space, but for the average person, to me, would be really exciting. I think it's an aspect of our hearing and listening that, because most people are used to listening on, earbuds or from the television, in mono, it gets underutilized, and I think is really exciting. And I think when properly, sort of utilized, to me, would be something that is really engaging.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dario. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The annual Music Tectonics Conference is known for bringing together people from across the music tech landscape to share ideas and get business done. In 2021, our unique conference approach invites a global audience to participate in parallel universes, in the metaverse, across the planet, and on a carousel by the sea. Mark your calendar for online events October 25th through October 27th, and in-person events outdoors by the sea in Los Angeles on November 2nd. We're maximizing what virtual events do best with two unique platforms. In the morning, we'll bring together dynamic and interactive panels of thought leaders plus our world-famous speed networking, so you can share ideas and build relationships frictionlessly across time zones. In the afternoon, we'll add even more serendipity as we invite you to the metaverse. Join us for that feeling of togetherness as you move your avatar through the crowd at a musical instrument demo, drop into the virtual expo hall, or strike up a chance conversation. Don't just talk about innovation in music, experience it at a conference like no other, Music Tectonics. Learn more and get a special early bird ticket price starting June 1st at musictectonics.com. Thanks for listening to Music Tectonics. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We put out new episodes every week. Want more? Find it at musictectonics.com. You can dig deeper into this episode, learn about our annual conference, get the Music Tectonics app, and sign up for our newsletter. musictectonics.com has it all. Also, look for Music Tectonics on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Clubhouse. And connect with me, Dmitry Vitsa, on LinkedIn. Peace.
You're listening to Music Tectonics.